Okay, so let's take two different functions. So we've got some functions in your notes, as you can see, and if you remember from grade 10, we have f of x equals 2x, a line with a slope of 2 and a y-intercept of 0, and f of x, g of x is equal to x. So we have a function f of x, and we have a function g of x. So what if we want to add those functions together? Well, let's make a new function, and let's call it h of x. So h of x is equal to f of x plus g of x. So what does that mean? Well, that means that we're going to take h of x and we're going to say whatever f of x is, 2x, and we're going to add to it whatever g of x is, x. Therefore, h of x is our new function equal to 3x, 2x plus x. So there's our h of x function. We could graph that one, but we're just going to confirm by graphing after. So now, let's do it by picking an x value. So let's pick an x value. X. And I'm going to state f of x and g of x and h of x. So let's pick a nice simple x value like -1. So -1. If I take a look at f of x, the line 2x, and I follow the pathway, f of -1 is the value -2, as I've circled in the graph. And g of -1 is -1, as I've circled in the graph. And as we talked, we are going to be adding the functions together. So if I simply take this value and this value, and I add them up, well, it's -2 plus -1, that's -3. Now I can put a point on the graph. Now, most people at this point have forgotten about the x value that we originally chose. So we chose -1, we got -3, so we can put that point on the graph. -1, -3. So now let's choose another x value. So how about we choose 0? So f of 0 is 0. G of 0 is 0. And 0 plus 0, 0 plus 0 is 0, which means we have the point 0, 0. And I can put that point on the graph. Let's choose one more x value. So when x is 1, well, when x is 1, f of 1 is 2. G of 1 is 1. And if I want to add those together, I get 3. Therefore, x was 1 and we got 3. So we have a point 1, 3. Now we can put a line through it. And we can call it h of x equals. Now, from grade 10, we have a y-intercept of 0 and a slope of up 3 over 1, which means we're simply going to have the equation 3x. Now, how does that compare with doing it by algebra? Well, it's obviously the same. So we can either do it by algebra, or we can just look at the graph, pick an x value to talk about, figure out what f of x is, figure out what g of x is, add them together, put the new points on the graph, and figure out what the equation is. Why would we learn to do it both ways? Well, sometimes we won't get what the functions are, and we just have to simply graph them by adding or subtracting or multiplying or dividing, etc. Okay, so let's take, again, f of x is equal to 2x, and g of x is equal to x. And now we're going to say that h of x is equal to g of x, f of x times g of x. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, h of x is simply going to be whatever f of x is, 2x, times whatever g of x is, x. Therefore, h of x is equal to 2x squared. So we could simply graph 2x squared, but let's do it graphically. So remember, we're going to choose an x value. We're going to find out what f of x is. We're going to find out what g of x is. And then we're going to find out what h of x is by this time multiplying. So if I choose an x value like -1, f of x is -2. Again, if I choose an x value of -1, g of x is -1. Now this time I'm going to multiply the values together. So -2 times -1 is 2. And we can put that point on the graph. Remember, x was -1. Don't forget that. H turned out to be 2. So we can put a point on the graph. -1, 2. Let's pick another x value. X value of 0. Well, f of x is 0. G of x is also 0. And 0 times 0 is 0 to get the point 0, 0. And we can put that point on the graph, 0, 0. Now we can choose another x value. X is 1. F of x is 2. G of x is 1. F of x times g of x is 2. And again, the x value that we were working with was 1, and the y value that we figured out was 2. Therefore, we have the point 1, 2, and then I can draw that parabola. And from grade 11, we should be familiar with what that parabola looks like, with a little bit of transformations, a little bit of a vertical expansion, and that equation is y equals 2x squared, or h of x equals 2x squared. Notice it's the same formula that we got by multiplying them together. So either actually multiplying the functions together if we're given the functions, or looking at the graph and adding or subtracting or multiplying or dividing the y values.